So I've got a lot of opinions about this book, so I guess I'm going into two parts now. Sorry about that. Being succinct has never been my strong point. So this is a continuation of a previous video about teaching Unplugged. I'm just going to pick up right where I left off, kind of assuming maybe you've watched the previous video. So the alternative to doing kind of a grammar syllabus is one alternative is a dogme approach, where you kind of get the students talking, you kind of listen to kind of what language they're kind of struggling with, and then you kind of help them with that language that they're currently struggling with, which is probably much better than the grammar syllabus. I'm oversimplifying a little bit, but I think that's kind of the underlying philosophy behind this. Now, as I kind of started reading through these kind of dogme lesson ideas, I was both kind of pleasantly surprised and a little bit disappointed to discover I was already kind of doing this. So what I had started doing a couple of years ago, kind of in reaction to kind of this idea that teachers should be sensitive to student emergent language, is I've been giving my students a topic to talk about, kind of some sort of story from their past. They talk to a partner. I kind of monitor for kind of what I think might be emergent language and do kind of feedback on the board. That's basically just what this is. A lot of this. It's just kind of conversation topics. Here's a topic to talk about. Feedback on the language you hear. Here's a topic to talk about. Feedback on the language you hear. Now, to give credit where credit is due, a lot of these are good topics. Some of them maybe not so much, although I haven't, I guess you never really know unless you try it. But yeah, I guess I was kind of hoping for something a little bit more mind-blowing. And it was just like, all right, give them topics. Yeah, I'm kind of doing that already. But I guess it shows I'm on the right track. Now, in my case, I didn't throw out the textbook completely because, like I said, I am kind of addicted to the structure and the feeling of completeness. But I have kind of started doing this, at least with my adult students, in the first half hour of the class. I was doing a half hour of topics and monitoring and stuff like that. I've also kind of discovered maybe some of the difficult points of monitoring and trying to find the emergent language. Maybe I'll talk about that a little bit later. Maybe I'll talk about that now, actually. A large part of me is very attracted to this. I do have some worrying points. Now, the authors do say, you can use this as much or as little as you want to. So if you want to use this at 30 minutes at the beginning of the class, and then the textbook for the next hour, yeah, that's fine, go nuts. And that's kind of more or less what I do. But they're also heavily implying, or not even implying, kind of outright stating, it's better if you just get rid of the textbook completely and just do all dogme all the time, like the whole lesson is a dogme lesson. And I do have a few reservations about it. I like a lot of it, but I'm a little bit nervous about it. Okay, so things that I'm a little bit nervous about. One thing is there doesn't seem to be a lot of room in this approach for kind of language input. So you're kind of working with the students on what they're creating, on what they're saying, and the teacher is kind of helping them to expand their language. So if the student is trying to kind of say something, the teacher says, okay, I hear you, here's how you could say it better. And that's kind of the input that the students are getting, I guess, is from the teacher, helping them to expand their language. So I wonder though, is that sufficient? I mean, there doesn't seem to be any place in this approach for kind of extensive reading and listening. I don't know. Arguably, maybe extensive reading and listening takes place outside the classroom. But, could the student get, I guess anytime you say it takes place outside the classroom, you are kind of leaving it up to chance, though, aren't you? Because you never know what the students are doing outside the classroom. Some of them might be reading and listening, and some of them might not be. So, like, assuming that they're not getting that input outside the classroom, are they really getting enough language input from the teacher? I mean, like, maybe you could work on kind of simpler language points, but, you know, like, something like reported speech or subordinate clauses. Are you getting sufficient input for this to naturally arise on its own? I don't know. Question mark? Yeah, maybe, maybe not. The other thing, talking about like my own experience monitoring for emergent language is tough, especially if you have a larger classroom and everyone's talking at once. You know, there's just this kind of roar of noise and you're trying to pick up language, but like everyone's talking at once, you listen in for one student. I've also found that it's much more difficult for intermediate or advanced students. So for like elementary students, you can spot the error very easily. Like, okay, you messed up the modal verb. Let me feedback on that. But when you get advanced students using complex sentences, you really kind of, if you're just picking up a sentence fragment, it's kind of hard to tell what they're actually saying, what the whole sentence is. You almost need to listen to one student for an extended period of time to kind of figure out what the error is when advanced students are kind of using more complex language. So kind of during the whole class discussion, it makes monitoring very difficult. Now, to their credit, to be fair, I guess, I think they're talking more about open class feedback, maybe. Like, I'm not sure they're talking about monitoring during when the students are actually talking. In fact, sometimes they even say, like, you know, play music. So like the students kind of can't overhear what their neighbors are saying. They feel less self-conscious about it. But yeah, and just kind of as a general principle, it's difficult to react in the moment to emergent language and figure out, okay, what are the students ready to learn now? What language is emerging? What language are they not ready to learn? You know, these judgment calls are difficult. Another thing is, I'm not sure it's a good idea to get rid of the grammar syllabus completely. Now, I said before that everything we know about language acquisition shows that you can't just give a student a language point, drill it, and then expect them to use it. It takes a lot of time. But there is an argument for teaching the students the rules receptively. So you can say, okay, look, I know you're not ready to use this yet, but this is how a passive works. So like when you see this in the reading, at least you know what it is, even if you can't use it. And that way it kind of increases the student's comprehension of text that they're doing receptively, because they kind of know it's a passive construction, for example. But there's also an argument that this increases noticing. So like when the students are kind of listening or reading to English, they can say, that's what we studied. I recognize that grammar point. And that kind of increases the salience of that grammar point. And then they start to notice it more, which helps the input kind of become intake. And then it kind of speeds up the rate at which they're kind of ready to try it out for themselves. And Thornberry knows this because he's talked about this in previous occasions. Some of his, I was watching a video of him when he was talking about this, the noticing hypothesis. He mentioned the noticing hypothesis in his other book, Uncovering Grammar. So there is an argument for at least doing a receptive grammar syllabus, even if the students aren't ready to produce it. So I'm a little bit, I don't know. I think you could make an argument for doing some sort of grammar syllabus, at least receptively, as kind of a supplement to this. These guys seem to be in favor of throwing the grammar syllabus away completely. Okay, another thing, kind of a comparison here. Task-based learning. So a lot of these things here are really very similar to task-based learning. For example, this one here, which I just opened up at random. One of us, none of us. So they have to kind of sit in groups and make sentences in the groups that correspond to one of us, two of us, three of us, all of us, none of us, using this grammar structure, or not even using a grammar structure, just using whatever language they want to use. That's task-based learning. Like, that's like a typical task-based learning thing. Now, they're kind of aware of this because, like, in the beginning of the book, they talk about task-based learning, and they say, we have the exact same philosophy as the people who like task-based learning. So task-based learning, you give them a task, you work on the emergent language. They said, where we are different is they say task-based learning has all these kind of stupid artificial tasks, like, you know, spot the differences in the picture, you know, typical task-based learning thing. And they're right to a large extent. A lot of the material you read in task-based learning is kind of stupid and artificial. I mean, don't get me started on some of the stupid artificial tasks I've seen in task-based learning workshops, where you think, well, that's stupid. You know, my 15-year-old students don't want to do that. You know, why do they have a motivation for doing this? I've just seen some really stupid things. But that is to kind of attack task-based learning at its weakest point. Because, well, there is a lot of kind of stupid and artificial stuff in there. Not all of it is. Some of the task-based learning ideas you can get in the books are personalized and kind of very similar to what they're presenting here. So from that standpoint, I think they're attacking kind of some of task-based learning stuff, but not all of it. And to be quite honest, if we're going to get super critical, there are one or two activities in here which are a little bit artificial. So yeah, not all of their own activities are kind of completely natural, although most of them are good. I'm being a little bit petty now. The other thing where they deviate from task-based learning, at least as it's described by some people, like Jane Willis in her book for a framework for task-based learning, always has an input stage. So if it's an open-ended task, before the students do it, you give them a recording of proficient speakers doing the same task. And then maybe they look through the transcript and you kind of highlight interesting language that the native speakers or the proficient speakers have used during the same task. Now, you don't prescribe the language in Jane Willis's view. You don't say, okay, now you have to use this language. But you do kind of highlight for the students what the language that native speakers or proficient speakers would use when they do this task, or use in this one example. And that seems to me kind of something that's missing from this approach, is the whole input stage. I guess this gets back to what I was talking about earlier, kind of input being kind of left out here. On the other hand, this is a concern I noted when I was reviewing Jane Willis's book. To create these materials where you have recordings of proficient speakers doing this task takes a lot of time. I even experimented with this a little bit myself. I thought I was going to do 20 questions in my classroom. So I got a couple colleagues to play 20 questions. I kind of videoed it, I transcribed it, but it took so much time. It took hours to get these people to kind of sit down, arrange a time to meet, videotape them, listen to the videos, transcribe the videos. In the end, I didn't even use it in my classrooms. Yet, I may, but it just takes so much time. And so I guess that's where Dogme has an advantage, is these are all kind of zero prep or very low prep activities. So you can't argue with that, huh? That being said, ideally, assuming time was no issue, an input stage would be better, maybe. But time is an issue, so I don't know. Okay. So yeah, those are all kind of issues I have with dogme. I'm not even sure. Yeah, I mean, let's be honest, in this kind of field of second language acquisition, nobody is really sure about anything. So I'm not even really sure if these are legitimate objections or not. They're just kind of questions I have. Okay, I think that's most of the things I want to say. The rest is just kind of little nitpicks, kind of points here and there. For example, speaking of nitpicks, it's interesting here, Michael Lewis gets quoted here in the first chapter, and this is from, if you go back to the bibliography, The Lexical Approach by Michael Lewis, a book I've reviewed here on this YouTube channel. Interestingly enough, Scott Thornbury did a very critical review of Michael Lewis's lexical approach, in which he said, you know, there's some interesting ideas here. He said, but you can't throw out the grammar syllabus in favor of a lexical syllabus. You need kind of, actually, he didn't say syllabus. But he did say kind of work on grammar. So, I don't know. Did he change his mind, or was this part of one of the Michael Lewis quotes he liked? The other thing is they quote Krashen as well here, kind of another author I've reviewed on this channel. And yeah, they're talking about Krashen's theories. And they said the success of immersion programs in bilingual contexts such as Canada adds supportive evidence to Krashen's claim for the value of input and the need for a silent period before productive skills kick in. Now, that's absolutely true. That is exactly what Krashen advocates. But where does this fit into dogme? Because, like, where's the silent period in dogme? Like, did I miss? I don't know. Maybe I missed it. Like I said, when I was reading this book, I got kind of a little blurry-eyed, kind of just reading through activity after activity. But unless I missed something, there's no allowance here for a silent period. You are just kind of getting the learners to talk and then reacting to what they would say. Now, Krashen argues that you don't even need to get the learners to talk that much. Just give them plenty of input and the talking will take care of itself. That's a little bit controversial, obviously, but maybe a silent period is not a bad idea. And it brings me to another question, like, come to think of it, is there any allowance in this book for a beginner class? Like, it all kind of assumes kind of at least maybe a high elementary or low pre-intermediate class, right? Because you need to get the students talking about these subjects to then kind of give them feedback on their language. So, I don't know, did I miss it? There is this appendix in the back where it talks about, you know, how to use dogme for all these different situations with a course book, with young learners, in an exam class. But, yeah, I don't know. I don't think I saw anything in here about kind of beginner English dogme. So, yeah, other kind of bits and pieces. Sorry, I should have mentioned this right at the beginning of the review. Maybe this is kind of self-evident. Thornberry is one of the most famous names in ELT. He's got a reputation for publishing on everything and anything. Luke Meddings I've never heard of before. So I'm probably, I told myself I wasn't going to do this, but I find myself slipping into it anyways. I just say Thornberry, 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 and completely forgetting about Meddings, because Thornberry is the more famous one. Thornberry just writes on everything. He's incredibly prolific, and in fact, I've reviewed a number of his books on this channel already, Beyond the Sentence, I think, and Uncovering Grammar. Because he kind of writes on everything, and because I guess this is kind of the nature of the field, he can easily kind of be accused of kind of self-contradicting himself. Like on one book, he's kind of arguing for kind of explicitly teaching grammar, and then another book he tends to be arguing against it. He's also kind of almost an establishment figure in ELT. He speaks at all the conferences. He's published so many books that are used in the courses. He He's published a course book for the CELTA, so not for the students, but for the CELTA. So it's almost a little bit strange to be reading this opening chapter here, where you're saying, look, the whole state of ELT is rotten and controlled by capitalist textbooks, and we've got to revolt and kind of start something else, when he's such a establishment figure himself. Not that that's necessarily contradictory. I mean, you can work for revolutionary change from within the establishment, but there is at least kind of one blogger, a guy named Jeff Jordan, who I found out from the TEFLology podcast, who I've started kind of reading his blog, and he kind of regularly rails against the state of ELT. And in fact, reading these chapters, I was reminded a lot about his kind of Jeff Jordan's kind of tone. What's interesting is Jeff Jordan will occasionally kind of criticize Scott Thornbury as a figure of the ELT establishment. I think he has like a couple blog posts where he goes after Scott Thornbury. That's just kind of by the by. I'm getting into kind of the nitpicky stuff. Speaking of which, yeah, I guess just a couple more observations. Hope I'm not breaking a confidence by revealing this, but a couple interesting things at my school regarding this book. I haven't really tried out any of these lessons myself, but I was talking to a fellow teacher, and she was saying to me, I've got this test today, I'm just kind of handing back the test to them, and then what do I do? Like, do I let them go home? And I said, no, you can't send them home early. And I said, do you need something? And she said, yeah. And I said, try this book. There's a lot of interesting ideas in this book. And so she took this book and flipped through it and kind of picked out an activity which was called Teach Me Something, in which the activity is the students kind of choose some phrases in their language, some common idioms or common proverbs in their language. They agree upon, in a multilingual class, they kind of teach each other. And a class where everyone speaks the same language, which is what this was because we were living in Vietnam. The students talk to each other, kind of agree on what the appropriate English translation would be, and then teach these to the teacher. And then I asked her about it after the class, and she said, yeah, it worked great. She said, it was too great. She said the problem was they didn't want to go home at the end of the class. They wanted to kind of keep teaching me more of these phrases and idioms the Vietnamese language has. She said, I couldn't get rid of them. And I said, well, yeah. I said, yeah, there's a lot of interesting ideas in this book. And I kind of thought, yeah, geez, maybe there are a lot of interesting ideas in this book. I really should try these out myself. So that's going to be kind of my project for the next few months, maybe, is to try and kind of try these ideas out myself. Okay, I think I'm just going to stop the video here. There's probably more to say. I'm going to think of something else I wanted to talk about as soon as I turned off the camera, but I've rambled long enough. I'll shut it off here. Thanks for listening.